Welcome to Thinkin, a podcast series by Kautilya School of Public Policy.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. To study history is to study change. Understanding patterns emerging through history can help policymakers make policy that stand the test of time.
At the Kautilya School of Public Policy, we had the opportunity of studying history, leadership and public policy from Professor Moshik Temkin. Professor Temkin is the Johnson & Johnson Chair in Leadership and History at the Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, and an Associate Professor of History and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Welcome, Professor. Thank you for agreeing to be here on our show. We know that this is your first time here in India, so how have you been liking this experience being in India? And I know that you've not been around, so in Hyderabad especially.
Well, Hyderabad is part of India, right? So I've been enjoying it quite a bit. I'm very happy to be in India. It's my first time in the country, and everything I see is new. So for me, I just learn new things every day, so it's been great.
That's great.
That's great, Professor. So throughout the course, we have an understanding about how important history and historical events is for a leader to take well-rounded and rational decisions. And we've also seen instances where history wasn't taken into consideration and the outcomes were very different. So Professor, how important do you think it is for the leaders of this generation to consider history before making decisions?
Well, I would hope that every serious leader considers history before making decisions, and not just before making decisions, but also during the entire political process or policy process that they have, because history is our best way of testing ideas and proposals and policies. We see in the past what may have worked, what didn't work, and hopefully people in positions of power or in public policy generally just apply those lessons.
Okay. So that's interesting, sir, because we do understand throughout the course that history is important, but these words, history, empathy, crisis management, they're also abstract with different perceptions of for different people. So actually we wanted to understand a bit of your thought while you were designing this course, and like the pedagogical skills, that the tools that you applied, that how can these abstract topics be taught to a class of such diversity. And like this is not just in India, you've been teaching this course to people in China, people in US and other places as well. So maybe if you can give us a bit of your thought when you designed this course.
I think that that's a really good question. I think that when, every country is different, and students from every country are different. And if I'm teaching the class in India, it's a different set of issues and problems that people will be concerned with. Even internally, they'll have differences versus people from other countries, let's say the US or whatever country you want to look at. But there are some things that are really universal. Everybody who is entering public policy that I know of in every country is interested in things like good governance, a better life for people, fair society, equality and access, quality of life, the ability to thrive in your community. So I find that no matter where I am, the issues resonate. So I can talk to Indian students about issues in the past that face leaders in America or Africa or any other part of the world, and it hopefully will resonate and it will seem familiar, because students in India might say, oh, we face those issues too. So I think that my experience has been, when I design a course, I want it to touch as many people as possible. Every case I choose has to address not just the specific country in which it's happening or it happened in history, but also people around the world have to be able to connect with it. And I like to think that it works.
Definitely. And thank you for telling us a bit about it. I think I can connect it a bit more about what we felt and what you thought you want us to feel. Thank you.
Indeed, Professor, because we've learned about leaders from all over the globe, but lessons of leadership were indeed universal. So also, Professor, I wanted to ask you about one thing. So we have had the opportunity to get to know about numerous leaders throughout the course of this entire, the course that was designed for us. So also it struck me that while we remember certain leaders in I mean, we remember certain leaders for their individual contributions, but we do remember leaders in unison. For instance, the leaders of the civil rights movement, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., or leaders of the American suffragist movement like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman, or someone closer to India, perhaps Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar and Gandhiji. So in such instances, we tend to glorify certain leaders and also denounce the others. So why do you think this usually happens, and does literature have any role to play in this?
Well, that's a good question. I tend to, it's true that I often in the case, and you mentioned some of the cases that I teach, I choose to put leaders together in juxtaposition with each other or comparing between them, because I think that there are major problems in history that we see in which different leaders confronted those problems differently. So, and they may have had similar goals, or they may have been part of the same world and the same movement, have the similar aspirations, but they reflect very different methods and temperaments and ideas about how to achieve that change. So in all the cases you mentioned, it's about, actually, they all have in common a desire for freedom and independence and equality. But then the question is, how do you get those things in very difficult circumstances? So I like to show different options, and to have these leaders in comparison often shows to students the different paths that people have taken in the past, and to say that these are still universal questions today about how we choose.
Absolutely, Professor, I agree.
It's interesting, sir, because I mean, you're saying that it does pose up questions, but a lot of times when we're looking at literature, we do see like a colored version of a leader coming through the individual historian, and especially because you're a historian as well, and I feel like they play a huge role in how the future leaders think about these fundamental topics like empathy and leadership, etc. So what do you think should be like the basic guidelines for a historian or a literature, anyone who's writing about history to think about, so that the future readers from multiple circumstances can make their own definitions rather than have someone else's thought color them? And yeah.
Well, it's we have to mix empathy with a little bit of distance from every topic. So I always believe that one needs to have emotion when looking at history, because these are real people that live through real things. But our emotional investment should make us empathetic, but should not distort or color too much the way that we view the past. So for me, there are topics that I look at that don't, it's not where I come from, but there are issues that I feel impacted people very strongly, and so I feel empathy with these people, but I still want to look at these leaders in a realistic way. And if there's one thing that I brought up again in our class, it's the importance of honesty. To talk about things honestly, to be very transparent, and to look at these leaders not as heroes or villains, but rather as human beings with flaws and strengths and flaws, and advantages and weaknesses.
Yeah, makes sense. And this is kind of what we were discussing as well, and I think the classic question of idealizing, demonizing versus humanizing individuals. And I mean, so this was when you were showing Lyndon Johnson's the photos when the Vietnam War was going bad, and there were like these photos of him holding his hand and like just completely distraught. And I think that was the first time I saw a leader thinking about the consequences of what he did, which he thought was good but actually turned out bad. But I think that picture in itself kind of humanized him for me, that okay, this is a guy who did something wrong, but he's now understanding it and repenting it. And so I mean, it's good to say that you humanize your leaders, but once someone has that much power, how much humanity can we afford to give to a person?
Well, I think the reason that the images that you're referring to are when Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War policy are really going poorly, and the results are not there, and people are dying. And I think, first of all, what strikes us and disturbs us about these, and he's just sitting there looking, as you said, very distraught and upset. So a couple of things. One is, it's very rare to see leaders in that situation. Leaders are very careful about their image nowadays. It's all managed and controlled, and if they, even when they make big mistakes that cost people dearly, many leaders that we witness don't seem to care, or if they do, they don't show it in a kind of honest way like that. But in those days, I guess it was more open, and there was more ability to show people, leaders, in that kind of reaction. So it's disturbing to us to see a leader who is so successful in this moment of failure. But what I think that makes that case like that interesting is precisely that Johnson does show that he cares. He cares about the success or failure of his policies. He cares about whether people live or die. And that's what makes him interesting as a leader. If a leader doesn't care about those things, and doesn't care about the success or failure or whether people live or die, it's less interesting for me to teach about, because there aren't that many lessons there. Here the lesson is, how do we have empathy? How do we care about the success of our policy? But also, how do we think correctly about history in order to get the policy right?
Interesting. Okay. It's just building on that question, like when you you're looking at, basically when you look at history, you're looking at emotions, you're looking at human reactions. So what is it that you need to know amongst yourself to know, okay, if the reaction that he's saying, it's not a narrative, versus if these are true reactions, that what you're feeling? Because at the end of the day, the job of a historian or anyone who's looking at history back is to say, okay, if this is what he did was out of true compassion for what he wants to do, or was it a narrative or a goal to lead to something else? So what is it that we need to cultivate amongst ourselves to make that distinction in the leaders or the history, and how did that unfold?
I think a lot of leaders have both of those things going on at the same time. So leaders have their, especially transformational leaders like Margaret Thatcher, or if you want to take an extreme example, Mao Zedong in China. These are leaders that made a big change in their societies. I think that, and around the world as well. I think they were really driven by their ideological preferences and their beliefs. But they also, they were also building a narrative about what they were doing and justifying what they were doing in terms of the meaning for it in history, the meaning of it for their countries and their societies. But at the same time, I think they really believed in those things. So I don't think it was fake. We can debate whether we agree with that or not, and whether the transformation is a good one or a bad one. And the case of Mao, I think, it's fascinating, because most people around the world would look at let's say the Cultural Revolution with horror.
Yeah.
But Mao is still seen as a national hero today, and
Exactly.
kind of worshipped in the country. So we have to look at both of those sides.
Exactly. I mean, that's what was interesting to us, because when we saw those remarks of what horrors Cultural Revolution gave, all of us got scarred. But the people there still consider Mao as the greatest leader who ever lived, and most probably might live. So it's interesting how the society comes to it. And it actually brings us to how we want to understand history. So we as public policy students, I think I engaged with history for the first time, and it was fascinating. It was amazing to understand it, because you could understand yourself more through it.
But also scarring. It was scarring. I'm sorry to have scarred everyone.
No, Professor.
I'll pay for your therapy bills.
But I do think we need to get a realist perspective of the backlash that leaders in general faced. We saw that leadership is not as rosy as they show. Leaders do face a backlash, and it is when they put up their strongest face is when they actually succeed in life. And also a follow-up question on that, Professor. So we have discussed a lot about wars through the course of through this course, and also we typically have a leader at the helm of the situation. And however, we forget that the leaders are humans themselves, and they are indeed fallible. So how do we judge leadership in crisis in this context?
The context of wars specifically?
Yes.
And violence.
And violence. So I see wars, it's true that we do talk about wars, and wars come in many different forms, right? But for me, wars are a kind of crisis. So it's a crisis moment, and it's really crisis moments that interest me in terms of understanding leadership. That's where leadership is really formed. That's where you see leadership really emerge, and important leaders come out of these situations, sometimes with the most power. but it's also how you see leaders displaying the most empathy and making decisions that are against violence sometimes, or resisting violence. So I think that it's really in moments of crisis where leadership is the most significant, and it also heightens issues. When I think you might have a different impression, but I think one of the things that is important in the class that I teach is to really convey how urgent and dramatic history is. So it makes us feel that history is alive. That's something that's hard to do. I mean, when I was at school, I didn't like history. It wasn't scarring; it was just boring.
I know.
I wasn't scarred. I had to memorize names and dates, and I'm not good at memorizing anything. So I had to remember those things, and I felt it wasn't really much fun for me. I actually liked other things more. But when I understood that history is actually life, so even when you talk about public policy, what matters in public policy? What matters is the effect that it has on people. And that you examine over time by looking at history.
Yeah.
So that's why history for me is the key. I'm glad you engage with history. I hope you engage more with history. There are many good historians out there
Definitely.
who could address public policy
Actually,
issues.
on that note only, we wanted to really get your laundry list or like some short list of like literature and movies.
That reminds me that I have to do my laundry. But go ahead.
Don't all of them. But like I wanted to get like maybe like 4 or 5 movies or literatures that you would like for us or even the viewers who are interested in understanding real history and life of people. Like, are there some movies that you can suggest to people that they can watch and then maybe they engage with life and leaders a bit more? If you can give some of those, that would be really good for us.
Okay. Well, I mean, two that hopefully people watch this and get a sense of what we covered in class. But I think two that I showed in this class were the Battle of Algiers, to talk about the Algerian War of Independence, beginning of the Algerian War of Independence, because I think that really raises the question of, in order to obtain freedom in a very unjust situation, which is a colonial control, what do leaders do to try to break free of that, and how violent do they feel that they need to be in order to obtain that? And on the other side, this is also important, how do leaders of the country that is fighting terrorism and independence movement or separatist movements, how do they react and what kind of violence do they use? And the Battle of Algiers is showing those issues, but it's also a great movie, I think, just for anyone to watch. And we also showed The Fog of War, which is a great documentary, I think, about the life of Robert McNamara, who is such a good example of a public policy official who arrives at the very top with all the makings of good policy making, but really falls into the trap of the Vietnam War, and we learn lessons from that. And I also think the film is very dramatically made and very entertaining. And some other films that I show, I actually like the film Army of Shadows, which was made in 1969 by the French director Jean-Pierre Melville, and that's about the French resistance during the Nazi occupation of France during World War II. And it raises really interesting questions because it doesn't romanticize the resistance, but it follows them and their lives on a daily basis. And it shows you the sacrifices that people actually have to make in order to resist tyranny and to resist genocide and occupation and the choices they make. It's very, very moving and powerful film. I also really like, this is not so much about public policy, but it's more about history and our perspective, is the Japanese film Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa, which is from, I think, 1950. And that is really interesting because it shows, it takes place in medieval Japan, but it's about a crime that takes place. And the crime is an assault on a married couple in the woods. But the person who committed the assault is on trial. But the film shows the different perspectives of how people actually remember the event.
Oh, wow.
The criminal, the two victims remember it differently, and a witness from the outside. And these 4 perspectives are completely different, and they leave us in the question of how people actually view things and remember things. And it shows the challenge that historians have in order to adjudicate what happened in the past. You have to understand that people have very, very individual, selective, self-serving, and distinctive ways of looking at what happened, even things that they saw. So for us as historians, that's a great
It's a very meta-analysis of
I
history.
recommend it, but it's also a fun movie to watch. So I recommend it, Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa.
Definitely. We've written all of that, and
Yes,
we'll put
Professor.
that in the description for people to watch. But thanks a lot for giving this to us.
Yes,
Thank you.
Professor.
Yeah.
So, Professor, I remember in one class, I remember very vividly, you talking about the story of
Was
a
it
young...
a scarring
No,
moment?
this was a fun one.
This was a really good one. So I very vividly remember you narrating the story of a boy who happened to write letters to governments of different countries asking them to send what their country had to offer. And towards the end of the class, you told that the boy was none other than you, and I literally had goosebumps. So, and it was a story of a young boy who was very inquisitive and wanted to travel the world. So, can you tell us, the viewers, the story about that boy and
what led you,
yeah,
like,
what
as a
led you?
kid, to do that?
Okay, and in the end, I'll pay you 150 US dollars for this psychoanalysis session. No, thank you for the question. It's true, I do tell that story. The context that I tell the story is because I was showing, we were talking about China, and I was talking about the opening up of China that happened at that time, especially towards the United States and Americans and so on. So yes, I was writing letters to different cities in the world that interested me at the time. I was a very young child, and I wanted them to send me information, and I wanted them to send me pictures of their city. I was I guess I was just a strange boy, very, nerdy and interested in the world, and I was interested in population, demography, census. I was interested in geography, cities, and so on. And especially for some reason, very distant cities that I considered very exotic at the time, I guess. So there were many cities on this list. And I thought, this is the period before internet and before just quick access to information. And I thought, why not try to get information directly from them? I don't remember how I came up with the idea. And I don't remember who helped me, if anybody helped me to... my mother may have helped me in one way or another.
That's nice of her.
To send the letters. Otherwise, it may have never gotten to the destination. But yes, I guess if you delve into my own psyche, which I'm always hesitant to do, because who knows what's lurking
What
there.
will come out.
Yeah, it's terrifying to, I wouldn't be able to fall asleep again. I think it's just the origins of my interest in the world and in history and other people who live in very different places from me, and to get to know their stories and, their experience of the world. And I think that in the same, as you know, we grow up, but the child is still in us.
Speaks a lot about how you are now, Professor. The way you actually explain in class through pictures, it really means a lot. You bring history to life is what I can tell.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Okay. So, I think we're at the end of it, but I think we want to really thank you for actually taking the time to come here, teaching us this course, making us reflect a lot,
Yes.
and just being there through this journey for us.
So I want to thank you for hosting me here. This is a very nice space, and this is a great opportunity for us to share our thoughts. The pleasure and honor were all mine. I love to visit here. I hope to visit again, and most importantly is keep thinking about these things. Keep seeking out history as a guide. It doesn't have to be just in a classroom. It can be on your own. You might have to go out of your way a little bit to read those things and see films. There's books, but there's also films. And even asking each other about your families, about where you come from, about your ancestors, and learning about each other, I think really makes you better at public policy.
Yes, Professor. On that note, I'd like to thank you for enlightening us with lessons of leadership throughout this course. And I'm sure that the students of Kautilya will carry with them these lessons for a long time to come. So from lessons of leadership from the Bible to Machiavelli, from the American suffragist movement to the civil rights movement, and lessons of leadership from around the globe, including from Vietnam, China, and whatnot. Africa, like we've seen lessons.
India,
of,
we did
yes,
talk about
Professor.
India. Let's not forget.
Yes, and we've learnt leadership can emerge from the most unconventional unconventional avenues. For instance, Felakuti, which we never thought we would. So all in all, it was a great, I mean, we've learnt a lot throughout the course.
The course was also an emotional roller coaster for us. On days we were empowered, energized and filled with hope, and on other days we were filled with despair and sadness on human suffering. But I would like to say that on all days we were, all the things and all the conversation that we had nudged us and moved us to move within, inside, and understand our own definition of leadership. And I think that was the most important thing for all of us, because leaders means different thing for different one, but are we able to understand our own leadership? That's what all of us took from it. So thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you, and in the future, the classes will discuss you. You're the next leaders to discuss.
We hope so.
We hope so,
in a
Professor.
good and inspiring way.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you, sir.
Professor.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for taking
Thanks.
this.